Okay, so we are now recording, Janet, and how lovely to
Okay.
see you after
You
such
too.
a long time.
I
So
know.
nice.
It's a delight. It's a delight.
Yeah. Well, I think we thought we'd come together today because we wanted to do something kind of to support Mental Health Awareness Week, which starts I think next week.
Yeah.
And I think we were thinking that in both our works, anxiety is a topic that comes up a lot, certainly for Relate. We thinking about it a lot with our clients and how it impacts on relationships. And I know, Janet, you've had so much to do with this area in your own work too. Could you say a bit more about that?
Well, it's interesting. I think we're more aware of anxiety these days. In a way, depression sort of had its day. We became very aware of it, and particularly its effect upon couples. And I did a lot of my work when I was professor at University of Exeter. I had a clinic specifically. It actually was called the Mood Disorders Clinic, but basically the referrals that came to it from GPs, because they were conscious of it, were people who were diagnosed with depression. An awful lot of the people that I saw there were really more anxiously depressed than depressed. They were more anxiety was really more in the way. And I think that what's happened, particularly as a result of COVID, that anxiety has risen much more up in our consciousness now, partly because of the kind of thing that I was seeing before, that actually it's not a simple thing when what you see, particularly between couples, that's playing out, that's like depression. It's often something quite different. It's a mood disorder. It's really anxiety, which can tip over into depression. And that that COVID, where we were all anxious, really made us all kind of alive to that. So I think that it's coming up, certainly in my practice, because I'm still working with couples in a private practice. I'm seeing it more playing out, and people recognizing it and coming in with, I have an anxiety disorder. People say,
Yes.
Maybe they haven't been diagnosed as having an anxiety disorder, but they've self-diagnosed.
Yeah. I think we see that as well. But I think what's so positive about all of this is, as you say, people really are becoming much more aware of it and feeling able to say it out loud.
Yes.
As opposed to, trying to keep it all in, which, generally speaking, in my experience as a therapist, that makes things many times worse. It stops you sharing those anxieties with people who might be able to actually help you look through a different lens, or perhaps suggest where it's necessary professional support.
Absolutely.
So talking about it, I think, is such a step forward.
It is a step forward. And I think another bit that's good about the fact that we're at least conscious of it, and maybe overdiagnosing it either in GP surgeries or among ourselves, is that before, anxiety is a very contagious state.
Yes.
Anxiety breeds anxiety. And it's very easy. First of all, it's very easy to project your own anxiety onto somebody else, because anxiety does that. It's infectious. So it's harder to own your own anxiety, particularly because you see it in somebody else. And I think what used to play out was the other thing about not naming it in yourself or recognizing it in somebody else, is that it's a blaming state often. If you weren't anxious, I wouldn't be anxious. If you didn't make this happen, I wouldn't be feeling the way I am, which is that I don't feel good about myself. So it can play out in a very blaming, guilt-inducing thing, until it becomes clear that actually the state that I'm in is anxiety, whether it's you're the one who's perpetrating it or not. It doesn't really matter if I recognize it in myself. At least there's a step toward owning it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point. And I'm thinking as well about, the whole family dynamic, because we've just been talking about kind of person to person. But, for one person to become highly anxious about whatever it is within a family context, and thinking about the repercussions of that, and how, different people within that family context interpret what's going on. So, from other adults right down to children. Yes. And I think sometimes it's very difficult to find the words, especially with children, about how an adult might be feeling. So it becomes more of an anxiety for a child, because they don't have that logical, conscious bit in which to process what's actually happening.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that, while we have classifications of anxiety in terms of individuals. So we have anxiety disorder. We've got attachment states, which talk about anxiety, but that's about individuals. What we don't have, as far as I know, and I used to teach family therapy, I used to train people in family therapy, so I ought to know this. We don't have a classification of anxiety as a family phenomenon. And I think that there is such a thing, and that's what you're referring to. I think
Yes.
there are anxious families. And I think that what happens with children is they can't name it. And they absorb anxiety. And then they become the symptomatic.
Yes.
people.
Yes.
And I think that that explains an awful lot. And, you know, I mean, I used to train people at the university who were training to do family therapy, and they were always put into CAMS clinics. And the kids would be the identified patients, and you would know that they were exhibiting things so much of the time that was about the family and not them. And the parents should have been the ones who were being seen primarily, not the kids, because that is a state that, anyway, that I think that's the point you're making.
Yeah, I think it's a point really worth making, because again, you know, in couple therapy, what we often see are families coming on, as you rightly say. You know, when you really kind of drill down into stuff, what you find is that the anxiety is held somewhere between the couple.
Yes.
And the consequence of that, and that lack of availability to actually recognize that in themselves,
Yes.
it translates, and it sort of almost infects
It
other
absolutely
areas
is.
of the relationship and other family members. Yeah.
I just want to tell you, you know, when I was thinking about this conversation with you, I looked up some studies on anxiety within couples. There isn't much that I could find anyway. But one of the ones that I looked at, it was not that. I think it's on my desk. Hang on. I think it was from in the 90s. It's not that recent. But what struck me was that I thought anxiety was going to be far and away one of the biggest killers of marital satisfaction. This was a marital satisfaction and anxiety. And it wasn't so straightforward. There were, I think I've got it right. It was wives' anxiety, of course. So this was 1992, I think it was. And the husbands who could manage, they didn't talk about how they managed it, except this one way. Husbands who did not globally think that their relationship was terrible, weren't that troubled by their wives' anxiety. And then they looked at a little bit, I'm not sure exactly how they did, but basically it was Gottman's whole thing about how you manage. Well, he talks about managing conflict, but this was about, if you had a sense of humor, if you had a kind of positive bent, you could manage your partner's anxiety. So you didn't ascribe her to you didn't say she belongs in the madhouse. You know, you didn't kind of immediately write her off. You thought of it as, this is, you know, something that needs to be managed. Was reading between the lines. That's what it seemed like. And you had an ability to roll with it. That's what it was. They mentioned humor. They mentioned a sort of positivity. And I thought, that's right. It is about managing it. And it is about not infecting and not writing it off and not ascribing it to something really pernicious.
No, that's really interesting, isn't it? What came into my head when you talked about that, Janet, was very much this idea of the management needs to be, if you like, from both partners.
Yes.
Because if you get into that situation where, you know, one partner is managing the other,
yeah,
I think that can lead to different difficulties.
yes, yeah,
Certainly, as you'll know, one of the things in couple therapy where people are coming along, and one of the things is sort of high anxiety levels about whatever it is, or just about themselves, is that ability to kind of create a non-judgmental, non-blaming space where this thing that's emanating from one or both of them can actually be popped on the other side of the metaphorical table, if you like, and sort of managed together. And I think that's where you get that sense of empowerment for people, as opposed to one partner having to manage the other. I mean, I'm not suggesting that in some situations it isn't where things are really very serious, there doesn't need to be some sort of different intervention, perhaps from a partner.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, very often the sort of anxiety levels that we see within couple therapy in our clinics, in our counselling rooms, very much benefit from that. Let's create some space here, because whilst
Yes.
we're not here to treat the anxiety, what we can do is help you both manage the impact of that on the couple relationship.
Exactly. So what's coming to mind as you speak is, yes, there's a difference between an anxiety disorder and anxiety.
Mm.
I think what happens is people get very frightened by anxiety, and if it isn't managed by the couple, within the couple, or by the person who's feeling anxious particularly, then it can grow into an anxiety disorder. It can become just really
Yes.
dysfunctional and getting into the way of living. And then it's a real problem for a couple. Then it's a real problem because it really can't be well managed. So I think what we, in our conversation, I think we need to be clear that we have up to now been talking about normal anxiety.
Yes.
And no, most people aren't clinicians and don't know the difference. So I during COVID, early in COVID, I was asked to speak on a webinar about resilience during COVID. And the main thing that came up in that conversation was about anxiety. Understandably, at that point, it was early on, we didn't have the vaccines yet. And people were really, we could have had an epidemic, I think, of anxiety disorders if people hadn't learned to manage to do something else, which is recognize when anxiety gets into a place where you have no control over things, it can go into that. And what I think most people managed to do was to go, I can't have control over COVID, but I do have control over what I can do while I'm in COVID.
Yes.
So it's about finding the positions of control so you then manage it.
Yes.
So something to say about that,
Yeah.
about how you can manage it in yourself.
I think that's a really very important point, because what it's highlighting for me is that bit around, when we feel anxious about something, we tend to want it just to go away,
Yes.
and for it to be resolved or moved on, or
Yes.
somebody take it away from me. But recognizing the bit in the middle that actually you can take back some power, you can take back some control over, is really very, very beneficial. And my sense on that is that if you've got that little tiny kernel of stuff that you can get hold of yourself, sometimes that grows as you see that it's possible to do it. Still can't control all of it, and it's still there, whatever the issue is, but that ability to manage it grows, and
Exactly.
That's self-perpetuating, isn't it?
Exactly. So, and I think that's where couples can become skilled, because I think that there's, as you point out, it's a two-way street. So you have the anxiety, and I'm going to make reference to my book now, because I think this is about being skilled in doing this. So I've got this book, as you know, called, hang on, I got to look, Good Relations, Good Relations, Cracking the Code of How to Get On Better. And it's not just about couples. It's about, there is a chapter on couples, but it's about generalized skills of how you can, based on a lot of research, not just that I did, but that others have done as well, about kind of basic skills of relating. And I think that this does come into play around anxiety. So one is knowing, and this is just on an individual level, knowing I'm in a state of tension or anxiety. And there are physical signs. A lot of people don't recognize it, but I've got them written down here, but I'll try to remember. There's a kind of, shallow breathing, tense. It's a tension state. And it's when your mind goes into fear of things that, it's not just fear, it's fear of it's anticipatory fear of what could happen if. That's anxiety. It's different from just fear itself. So recognizing that you're in that state and your mind is going into that place, there are ways to override it. So that's a kind of skill of emotional management, of kind of doing the kind of, that's kind of quasi-mentalizing, quasi-mindfulness, and then kind of knowing, oh, I'm in that state. I need to do diaphragm breathing, not shallow breathing, but get myself into, I'm doing it now. My shoulders are down, my jaw is not clenched, all of those things. And you can do it in a second. And people don't notice. People think people will see, but actually I've done it on a bus. So I know you can do it. I don't think anyone's watching me. So there's that. On an individual level, knowing that. Then the other person, the partner, kind of needs to be aware of that. So noticing. But also, once you're in that state, you're able to be in relation to someone else. That is, say you're in relation to your partner at this point. And that's about not just I'm in this state, but what state is he or she in as well. And given that it's infectious, let's see if we can figure out my effect on that person and what might be happening. So there's a kind of two-way street that's happening from the off. If you can take responsibility for knowing, and that second step is called mentalisation. So you're thinking about yourself, and you're also thinking about yourself and the other person, and what you know about that other person could be happening.
So there's quite a lot there, isn't there, about noticing. Noticing where you are. And when you were just talking about the kind of possible symptoms for this, I was thinking about, the classic, oh, I think I've got a bit of a tension headache.
Yeah.
And you're carrying on. So maybe, I mean, how many times might we all say that about ourselves? I've got a bit of headache. So recognizing and perhaps taking that lovely phrase, taking a step back and thinking, hang on, what's going on here? Is it just a bit of a headache, or am I actually feeling a bit? And I think your piece around the anticipatory anxiety is so important, because the things we start worrying about before actually necessarily it's time to worry about them.
That's anxiety when you start doing that.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that can be useful. Like if you have an exam, it's useful to go, what could it be, and then do something about it. It's not useful in COVID to be going, what could possibly happen to the world? That's not useful.
No. I think the other thing that's also worth saying, though, that there are occasions where I mean, being anxious is I would suggest a very normal state for every human being, to greater or lesser degrees. But also sometimes it's necessary to be anxious, because that's going to generate some behaviors that could be helpful.
Yes.
To another person. So I think it's not helpful to look at anxiety through the lens of, there are ways of getting rid of it, ways of managing it.
No,
sometimes actually it's doing you a favor. I'm feeling anxious. Am I noticing something out there on the peripheral view that actually I need to be taking more notice of?
Absolutely. And then of course there's the more general anxiety that if you just deny, it's not useful either. So I think I've got this funny mole here. Oh, never mind. Or there's a lot of smog in the air. Should I not take any notice of it and do nothing about climate change? There's something. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about how these things sort of translate within sort of couple therapy, and that ability for people just to come together and acknowledge that in a way they have a responsibility to themselves around anxiety, but also to each other. So I'm thinking about that ability of a partner to be gently curious of, I think I noticed you seem a bit anxious, to actually sometimes name it.
Yes.
And not have that as you're really being rather anxious here. You shouldn't be.
That's the blame. That's the blame
thing, which really isn't helpful. Doesn't help anybody at all.
Yeah.
And I think having witnessed that many times over the years in working with couples, it just creates much more of a shell to go into, and an inability to actually say, well, actually, you're right. I do feel anxious about X, Y, and Z. Can we talk about it? Completely. So that use of kind of gentle curiosity as opposed to questioning of someone you're with, I think it's really helpful.
Sorry to interrupt, but it does show that I think what happens is anxiety is infectious because it creates anxiety, because people are afraid. And when
Yes,
fear is in the air, which is
yes,
part of anxiety, they get afraid. So when the partner says, don't be anxious, I mean, or it's often what it is it can be, as you pointed out, they say, I can't remember what you said, why are you anxious, but whatever, but it's dismissive in one
yes,
way or another,
yes,
either blaming or dismissive. And dismissive can be, don't be anxious,
yes.
like, don't be anxious. Well, I can't not be anxious, and that doesn't help. I already am anxious, so I can't just make it go away. So it is go on.
I was just going to say, I think that's sometimes a natural thing in all of us. You want to save somebody pain, so trying to sort of gently, as you say,
don't be anxious.
Nothing to be anxious about. It's all okay. It's. I think sometimes that actually ramps it up, because
it completely does.
People feel that their anxiety is not actually being taken seriously.
Exactly. It's like, what do you mean don't be anxious? If I could not be anxious, I wouldn't be. Who wants to be? Who wants to be
anxious? Yes, absolutely.
But it also, I think and of course you're right, it's a human reaction. I know I do it. The first thing is, if my children were anxious, I would be anxious for them. I didn't want them to be anxious. So the first thing might be, oh, don't be anxious, but that's about me.
Yes.
It's about me. It's about the person saying, don't be anxious. It's about them. Like, don't do this to me, please. Don't do this to me.
Do you know what? I'm so glad you touched on that, because I think that is so often we think we're trying to be, don't be anxious about that. You don't want to be worrying about it yourself.
That's right.
Maybe you think you've got enough to worry about, or maybe you think, look, that's not my worry, but I'm going to worry about it if I know you're worried. All of those things. I think I think that's such an, because I think if you recognize that, it gives the opportunity to respond slightly differently.
Absolutely. In fact, I had a discussion with one of my sons, who are now grown up, fairly recently, and he was confiding to me about things about his relationship. And I went into therapist mode. This was, a while ago. I went into sort of, kind of, but I didn't go into therapist mode. That was the point. I think I was, I thought kindly, gently, but dismissive. I think I must have been, like, oh, really? Oh, maybe that's not so worried. Maybe you shouldn't be so worried about that. Something like that. And then I noticed that he closed down. So we had a conversation about it a while later. He said, Mom, I'm not going to tell you things because I don't want you to be anxious. He knew that response was about me worrying for him. And I went, absolutely. I mean, I had to own it immediately, because, well, for one thing, I didn't want him to close down anymore. But I also went to, he got it. He got it because he picked up my anxiety.
Yes. And that, I think really the sort of nub of what we're getting to here, Janet, is that we generally are coming at this for the best reasons, but sometimes the best reasons sort of misfire.
Exactly.
And so it sort of rings true, this thing around if it's just possible to just be open to other people sharing an anxiety with you. They're often not asking you to make it go away or to solve the issue or whatever it is. What they're just asking is to be heard.
Exactly. Just to
play it.
And also you process it that way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, sometimes that's hard to hear. If you're a partner and, especially if the anxiety is an effect on you, it's about something that you share, it's hard to hear.
Yes.
So I think that's where we can now talk about therapy. So sometimes that's where couples get railroaded. They get off course over issues that make them both anxious. They can't talk about it because it flares up, or they close down because they've tried and they don't know how. So I think that's where we can help couples learn how to manage their own anxiety states and listen. And in the listening comes sometimes solutions. I mean, sometimes not. Sometimes it's just hearing it or learning to live with it, or that's a solution, something. comes out of that.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really important bit here, because sometimes if we sense that someone we love is anxious about something, we might assume that it's because it's something that we've done,
Yes,
and we don't want to feel bad about ourselves. So that's another reason kind of not to explore it too much.
that's right.
And I think it may be about something that we've done or said or not said. But again, as you say, in therapy, it's helping people just stand back from it and look and see what they do.
Yes,
Which then, once people have got an idea of how they normally approach these situations, it raises all those different possibilities about how they might choose to do it differently.
that's right.
And when you do things differently, sometimes you get a different response, which is the helpful one. So I
Yes.
think, yeah, and I think really what we're saying here is, don't put off going to therapy to talk about it.
Exactly. And in therapy, I think you can learn that that partner that you thought couldn't listen to you, or
Yes,
that partner that you thought was useless at coming up with any solution for you, you have a new experience of them,
yes,
and you can transform. And that curiosity that you talked about pays off because
Yeah.
you learn something about each other.
yeah, absolutely. And I think in therapy, that's all we can ever ask of our clients, to learn to listen differently, and then invariably you sometimes hear something different as well.
Yeah, and learn about each other.
Yeah. Well, I think we've and I've really enjoyed our conversation,
Right.
Janet, and I think there's so much that we could say. I mean, we just touched on 2 or 3 different things, but it's been great talking with you about it, and look forward to doing it another time on the same or maybe a different
We
topic.
will.
So
There's
thank
so
you
many
so
more.
much indeed. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.